On the morning of April 14, 1983, the auctioneer drove a wooden stake into the cracked ground on a neglected 120-acre farm outside Hays in Ellis County, Kansas. Dust lifted with every boot that crossed the field. The winter wheat had failed 2 seasons in a row. 2 abandoned windmills stood without movement beneath a pale blue sky, and 3 dry stock ponds had become nothing more than bowls of hardened clay. Every local farmer knew the place by a single name, the Dry Quarter. The bank wanted it gone before another tax payment came due. Nobody expected the last bidder to be a 19-year-old boy carrying a faded canvas notebook instead of a checkbook. The auctioneer glanced at him once before reading the opening price, $22,000. Silence. Not a single hand moved. The older farmers folded their arms. Some shook their heads before the bidding had even begun. They had watched the previous owner lose nearly everything trying to coax crops from soil that seemed determined to reject life itself. The young man finally lifted one hand. His name was Samuel Carter. He had grown up 20 miles away in Russell County, helping his grandfather repair broken fences, grease wagon hubs, and rebuild old engines that everyone else called junk. His boots were scuffed. His denim jacket had been patched twice across one shoulder. He looked more like someone searching for work than someone buying a farm. The auctioneer repeated the bid. No one answered. The gavel came down. Just like that, Samuel Carter became the owner of the driest 120 acres in Ellis County. Nobody applauded. Instead, quiet laughter spread across the crowd. It started near the livestock trailers before rolling through the gathering like wind across brittle grass. One man leaned against his pickup. Another removed his hat just long enough to wipe tears from laughing too hard. Samuel simply signed the papers. He thanked the auctioneer. Then he walked toward the abandoned farmhouse without looking back. Let me tell you about Samuel Carter. He had never inherited rich ground. He had never won awards at the county fair. His father died during the harvest of 1978 after a highway accident involving a grain truck loaded with Milo. His mother worked at a small hospital in Russell while Samuel finished high school. Money stayed tight, but his grandfather, Henry Carter, taught him something far more valuable than wealth. Never argue with land. Listen first. Henry believed every field told its own story. Some spoke through weeds, others through stones. Water left clues for anyone patient enough to notice them. Most people were simply too busy trying to force answers. Henry wasn't. Neither was Samuel. Inside the notebook he carried were years of handwritten observations collected while helping older ranchers across central Kansas. Notes about grasses, notes about limestone shelves, notes about abandoned wells dug before World War II, notes copied from county geological surveys that few people bothered reading. People assumed he studied farming. He was actually studying water. The old farmhouse smelled of dust and mice when Samuel unlocked the front door for the first time. The roof leaked. Half the windows were broken. The kitchen floor sagged toward the cellar. Still he smiled. Outside stood another survivor, a faded 1954 Farmall Super MTA. The red paint had almost disappeared beneath decades of sun. Rust covered the rear wheel rims. One headlight hung sideways. Birds had built nests beneath the seat. Most buyers would have hauled it directly to scrap. Samuel walked around it slowly. He rested one hand across the cast-iron hood. Then he noticed something. The engine block wasn't cracked. The tires were ruined. The wiring had been chewed apart, but the tractor itself remained complete. Its original 4-cylinder engine still sat exactly where International Harvester engineers had placed it nearly 30 years earlier. Around 50 horsepower on the belt. Nearly 6,000 pounds before ballast, heavy enough to pull through stubborn ground that lighter tractors often skipped across. Henry had once called the Super MTA the bridge between old farming and modern farming. Strong, simple, honest. Samuel whispered quietly, "I think we'll work together." 3 days later, the local feed store became the center of every conversation in town. Coffee cups rested beside weather reports. Farm prices filled one bulletin board. The new owner of the Dry Quarter filled every conversation. "You hear about that Carter kid? He'll lose everything before Christmas. Ground hasn't held water since '76. I give him 2 harvests." Standing among them was Richard Bennett. 42 years old, vice president of High Plains Agricultural Lending, pressed shirt, clean boots, new diesel pickup. Richard had approved dozens of foreclosure notices across western Kansas. Numbers made sense to him. Soil reports made sense to him. Hope didn't. When Samuel entered the store carrying hydraulic filters for the farm, every conversation stopped. Richard smiled politely. "So you're the young man who bought the dry quarter?" Samuel nodded. "I am." Richard looked towards several nearby farmers before chuckling. Then he laughed openly. Not cruelly, confidently. The other farmers joined him. The room echoed with comfortable certainty. "You bought 120 acres without dependable water," Richard said between laughs. "Son, you didn't buy farmland. You bought the biggest dust collection in Ellis County." More laughter followed. Several men slapped the counter. One nearly spilled his coffee. Samuel waited until every voice settled. Then he placed the filters onto the counter. "I may be wrong," he said calmly. His voice never rose. "But land usually remembers more than people do." No one answered immediately. Richard smiled again. "I hope you're right." Samuel tipped his cap. "So do I." He paid for the filters, walked outside, started loading supplies into his truck. He never noticed the elderly mechanic standing across the road, watching everything. The old man wasn't looking at Samuel. He was staring at the faded farmal chain behind the pickup. And then, almost under his breath, he spoke words that would change everything. That tractor came from the only well on this place that never truly went dry. Samuel stopped fastening the last chain across the farmer's rear axle. The elderly mechanic shuffled across the gravel with slow, deliberate steps, his boots leaving shallow prints in the dust. He wore grease-stained bib overalls and an old cap faded almost white by Kansas summers. His hands were black with years of engine oil that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. "My name's Walter Briggs," he said. "Ran the repair shop here in Hayes for 38 years. Samuel shook his hand. Walter looked past him toward the abandoned farm. "I serviced at Super MTA since 1956. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "You knew the previous owners?" "I knew every owner." Walter rested one hand on the tractor's hood. "They all believe the same thing. Dig deeper. Drill another well. Spend more money." He paused. They were digging in the wrong places. Samuel remained silent. Walter noticed a notebook tucked beneath Samuel's arm. A faint smile crossed his face. "So you've been studying, too?" Samuel nodded. "I've been reading county geological surveys from the 1930s. Walter's eyebrows lifted. "Most folks don't even know those exist. They mention limestone fractures running beneath this township." Walter looked around to make sure nobody else was listening. "Meet me at your farm tomorrow morning." "Why?" "Because there's something buried out there that people forgot." Before Samuel could ask another question, Walter climbed into his aging Chevrolet pickup and drove away. The next morning arrived with a hard western wind, pushing dust across the empty fields. Walter showed up carrying an old leather tube. Inside were yellowed survey maps. Some dated back to 1919. Others carried handwritten notes from county engineers who had mapped underground formations before modern drilling equipment existed. Walter spread one map across the hood of the farm. "Let me tell you about this land." He pointed toward the western edge of the property. In 1921, a farmer named Thomas Ellsworth settled here. Everyone remembers him for losing the farm during the drought. Walter tapped another spot on the map, but almost nobody remembers why he survived the first 20 years. Samuel leaned closer. There was water. There was hidden water. Walter traced a thin blue pencil line that disappeared beneath several limestone ridges. Not a river, not an underground lake. A fractured limestone channel feeding slow, constant groundwater. Samuel's pulse quickened. So why did every well fail? They didn't. Walter looked directly into his eyes. They simply kept drilling beside it instead of into it. Samuel studied the map for several long moments. Every abandoned windmill, every dry pond, every collapsed well, none of them lined up with the old survey. They had all been placed where the land looked convenient. not where the rock suggested water flowed. For the first time since buying the farm, Samuel felt something stronger than hope. Evidence. Over the following weeks, he never rushed. Every morning began before sunrise. He repaired fences, cleared brush, measured elevations with an old transit level borrowed from the county extension office. Every evening ended with another page inside his notebook. Richard Bennett drove past twice during those weeks. Each time he saw very little happening. No crops, no drilling rig, no construction. Just one young farmer walking field with measuring stakes. At the coffee shop, the jokes grew louder. He must be planting rocks. I hear he's talking to dirt now. Maybe dust grows better if you measure it. The laughter always returned. Samuel never answered. Instead, he worked on the farmel. The old engine came apart piece by piece inside the machine shed. Each bolt was cleaned by hand, each bearing inspected, each gasket replaced. Walter helped whenever he could. One afternoon, they lowered the crankshaft back into place. Walter smiled, still straight. Samuel grinned. They built these to last. They built them to be repaired. That evening, Walter handed Samuel the original purchase receipt. International Harvester Farmel Super MTA. Delivered March 18, 1954. Purchase price, $2,863.40. Sold new to Thomas Ellsworth. Walter had kept the receipt for nearly 30 years after closing his repair shop. I figured someday someone would care. Samuel folded it carefully into his notebook. I do. A few days later, Richard Bennett arrived unexpectedly. His clean pickup rolled into the yard while Samuel and Walter were reinstalling the cylinder head. Richard climbed out. I heard you're spending more time fixing antiques than farming. Walter continued tightening bolts without speaking. Samuel wiped his hands. This tractor still has work left. Richard glanced around empty fields. You don't even know where your water is. Samuel looked toward the western ridge. I think I do. Richard followed his gaze. Planning to drill? When the time is right. Richard sighed. Listen, Samuel. His voice softened. I'm not here to embarrass you. I know. I've seen too many young farmers lose everything chasing dreams. Samuel nodded respectfully. I appreciate that. Richard hesitated. Sell me the land. Samuel looked surprised. I have investors willing to pay $28,000. Nearly $6,000 more than Samuel had paid only weeks earlier. It'll become grazing ground. You'd make an easy profit. Walter quietly watched from the tractor. Samuel smiled politely. No, thank you. Richard frowned. You're turning down guaranteed money. I'm turning down unfinished work. Richard climbed back into his truck. I hope stubbornness doesn't become expensive. After he drove away, Walter laughed softly. He thinks you're chasing luck. Samuel shook his head. I'm chasing a map. Several days later, the farmel came back to life. Walter poured fresh fuel into the tank. Samuel pulled the choke halfway. The starter groaned once, twice. Then the four-cylinder engine fired with a deep, steady rumble that echoed across the empty fields. Blue smoke drifted from the exhaust before fading into clear air. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. I haven't heard that sound in 15 years. Samuel rested one hand on the steering wheel. So have I. You've driven one before? My grandfather owned a Super M. Walter smiled. Their family. The tractor spent the next week pulling an old blade across abandoned fence lines. Not because Samuel needed smoother ground, because he wanted to read the land. The heavy rear tires revealed subtle changes in soil firmness. Some sections stayed powder dry. Others held moisture just beneath the surface. Patterns began appearing, exactly where the old survey predicted. Let me tell you something about groundwater that surprises most people. People imagine underground water as giant hidden lakes waiting beneath the earth. In reality, much of it moves slowly through cracks in limestone, sandstone, or gravel layers. Those fractures act like natural pipelines created over thousands of years. A well drilled only 20 feet away from one of those channels may produce almost nothing, while another drilled directly into fracture can provide dependable water for decades. Success is often less about drilling deeper than drilling smarter. Old farmers who understood local geology sometimes found lasting water with far simpler equipment than many modern crews expected. By early June, Samuel had marked one final location. It sat halfway between two abandoned wells, exactly where nobody had ever drilled. Walter stared at the stake. "You ready?" Samuel nodded. Before sunrise the next morning, a small cable tool drilling rig rolled slowly through the front gate. Richard Bennett happened to be driving the county road when he saw it turn into the dry quarter. He pulled onto the shoulder, folded his arms, and watched the drill begin its first strike into the Kansas limestone. Then, at exactly 34 feet, the drill suddenly dropped straight down, and every man on the site froze. For one long second, nobody moved. The cable snapped tight. The heavy drill stem, which had been striking solid limestone only moments before, suddenly plunged nearly 4 feet without resistance. The rig shuddered. Dust drifted from the derrick. Even the engine settled into an uneasy idle. The driller, Earl Simmons, pulled off his gloves. "That's no cave," he muttered. "That's an open fracture." Walter stepped closer, without saying a word. Samuel looked down into the narrow borehole. He couldn't see anything except darkness, but he smiled, not because he knew what would happen, because the land had finally answered. Earl slowly lowered a steel bailer into the hole. Minutes passed. Nobody spoke. When he cranked the cable back up, the bottom of the bailer dripped with cold, clear water. Not muddy, not cloudy, crystal clear. Walter closed his eyes. "I haven't seen water from this ground in 40 years. Richard Bennett was still standing beside the county road. He saw the men gathering around the drilling rig. He climbed out of his pickup and walked toward them. "What happened?" Nobody answered immediately. Earl simply tipped the bailer. Water splashed onto the dry Kansas soil. Richard stared at it. His expression didn't change. "Not yet. One bucket doesn't prove anything," he finally said. Samuel nodded. "You're right. It could disappear tomorrow." It could. Richard folded his arms again. "I've seen shallow pockets fool people before." Samuel never argued. He simply looked at Earl. "Keep drilling." Hour after hour, the rig worked deeper into the limestone fracture. 50 feet, 68, 81. At 93 feet, the drill reached a steady flow. Water continued entering the bore faster than the bailer could remove it. Earl looked at his gauges. Then he looked at Samuel. "I think you found your well." A permanent casing was installed over the next 2 days. When the submersible pump was lowered into place and the switch was finally thrown, a strong stream of water burst from the discharge pipe, sparkling beneath the June sun before splashing into an empty stock tank. Nobody cheered. Nobody shouted. Walter simply took off his cap. Samuel watched silently as the tank slowly filled. Richard stood several yards away, unable to look anywhere else. The dry quarter had water, real water, not enough for a city, but more than enough for a farm. News traveled across Ellis County faster than a summer thunderstorm. By the weekend, pickups lined the county road. Farmers who had laughed at the auction now walked the property with quiet faces. Some inspected the new well. Others studied the old survey maps Walter had brought. A few simply stood beside the running water, trying to understand how every expert had missed it. Let me tell you about pride. Pride rarely disappears all at once. It leaves slowly, one uncomfortable truth at a time. Many of the men standing there had farmed longer than Samuel had been alive. Some had survived droughts, floods, low cattle prices, high interest rates. They knew hardship. But experience can become its own blindfold if it convinces you there is nothing left to learn. Samuel never reminded them of that. He didn't have to. The water did. By late July, the Farmel Super MTA was working every day. Its rebuilt engine settled into a deep, even rhythm that echoed across the fields from sunrise until evening. The old tractor pulled a 14-foot tandem disc through ground untouched for years. It hauled fencing supplies, dragged fallen cottonwood trunks away from the creek bed, pulled a seed drill across fields everyone else had abandoned. Walter often rode beside Samuel on the steel fender. Neither man talked much. They didn't need to. The machine carried enough memories for both of them. One afternoon, Richard returned. This time he parked beside the barn instead of the road. Samuel shut off the tractor. The sudden silence seemed louder than the engine had been. Richard walked toward him. "I owe you something." Samuel waited. "I owe you an apology." Walter quietly smiled but stayed where he was. Richard looked across the green strips beginning to appear where new sorghum had sprouted. I laughed. "Yes, I shouldn't have." Samuel shrugged gently. "You weren't the only one." "No." Richard looked down at the dirt beneath his polished boots. "But I was the loudest." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Richard reached into his truck and removed a worn leather folder. "I found these in our bank archives." Inside were foreclosure documents from 1961, maps, well logs, loan inspections. Samuel turned each page carefully. Near the back was a handwritten note from an agricultural inspector. One sentence had been underlined: "Possible productive limestone fracture west of abandoned windmill. Further testing recommended." The recommendation had never been followed. Budget cuts had ended the project. The file had been forgotten. Richard shook his head slowly. "We almost had the answer 60 years ago." Samuel closed the folder. "But nobody listened." Richard nodded. "No. Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Not because you were smarter, not because you wanted to prove someone else foolish, but because something deep inside refused to let go of what your own eyes had seen. Sometimes the hardest part isn't finding the truth. It's waiting patiently while everyone else catches up to it." Harvest approached. Rain finally arrived during the first week of September. Not a violent storm, just 12 steady hours of soaking rain. Water collected in the restored ponds. Grass thickened. The new well never slowed. The pump ran with the same calm rhythm day after day. Richard began visiting regularly, not as a banker, as a student. He asked questions about the survey maps, groundwater, old machinery. Walter answered some. Samuel answered others. One evening, after checking the pump house, the three men sat on overturned buckets watching the sunset paint the Kansas prairie gold. Richard broke the silence. "My father always said new equipment solved every problem." Walter chuckled. "My father said understanding the problem solved it first." Samuel smiled. "I think they were both partly right." Richard laughed quietly. This time no one laughed at another man. They laughed together. The first sorghum harvest exceeded every prediction made by the county extension office. Truck after truck rolled from the dry quarter, carrying grain grown on land everyone had declared finished. But the greatest surprise wasn't the harvest. It came 2 weeks later. A geologist from the state university arrived after hearing about Samuel's well. He spent an entire afternoon studying the limestone beneath the farm. Before leaving, he unfolded a fresh geological map across the hood of the farmel. Then he pointed toward the neighboring properties. "There isn't just one groundwater fracture under this farm," he said quietly. "There are 3. Walter looked at Samuel. Samuel looked toward the western hills. Because if the geologist was right, the dry quarter had never been the only farm sitting above forgotten water. The geologist returned 3 weeks later with a larger survey team from the state university. They carried drilling records, aerial photographs, and instruments that could measure subtle changes beneath the ground without digging a single hole. By late October 1983, their findings confirmed what Samuel's notebook had quietly suggested for years. The limestone fracture beneath the dry quarter was part of a much larger underground network stretching across several neighboring sections of Ellis County. The water had always been there. People had simply misunderstood the land above it. Within the next 2 years, 3 neighboring farms repositioned their wells using the updated geological surveys instead of old assumptions. Every one of them found dependable water. Not endless water. Not miraculous water. Enough water to keep livestock healthy, irrigate carefully managed fields, and survive dry summers that once would have forced another foreclosure. Richard Bennett watched every one of those drilling projects. This time he wasn't approving foreclosures. He was helping arrange low-interest improvement loans for farmers willing to study their land before spending their savings. The experience changed him. He stopped judging farms by appearances alone. Whenever young producers walked into his office with unusual ideas backed by careful research, Richard listened first. Some projects still failed. Farming had never offered guarantees. But he no longer laughed before hearing the whole story. Samuel never became famous. He never appeared on television. His photograph never appeared in national farm magazines. He preferred it that way. Most mornings still began before sunrise. He checked fences, serviced machinery, walked the fields with the same faded notebook tucked beneath one arm. New pages slowly filled the empty spaces. Rainfall totals, crop rotations, bird migrations, water levels inside the well, observations that most people considered too ordinary to matter. To Samuel, they mattered more than almost anything else. The Farmel Super MTA remained at the center of the farm. Children who visited assumed it belonged in a museum. Samuel always smiled. It already belongs where it works. Every winter, he changed the oil himself. Every spring, he adjusted the valves. Every autumn, he cleaned the radiator by hand after harvest. The old tractor never became perfect. It leaked a little oil. The paint continued fading. The seat squeaked over rough ground. None of that mattered. The engine kept starting. The transmission kept pulling. The machine continued doing exactly what it had been built to do back in 1954. Let me tell you about old machines. People often admire them because they look nostalgic. The farmers who depended on them admired something very different: predictability. An old tractor that had been properly maintained rarely surprised its owner. Every sound meant something. Every vibration carried information. Repairs were usually straightforward because the people who built those machines expected ordinary farmers to keep them running with basic tools, patience, and mechanical understanding. That simplicity created trust, and trust is often worth far more than the newest technology. Walter Briggs continued visiting every Thursday afternoon. Sometimes they repaired equipment. Sometimes they never opened a toolbox. They simply sat beneath the cottonwood tree beside the machine shed, drinking coffee while the wind turned slowly through the shelter belt. One afternoon in 1991, Walter handed Samuel a small wooden box. Inside lay the original brass ignition tag from the Farmel. "I took it off during a repair back in 1968, Walter admitted. "I always meant to give it back." Samuel held the worn piece of brass carefully. "It belongs on the tractor." Walter smiled. "It belongs with someone who understands why it matters." Walter passed away peacefully the following spring at the age of 83. His family asked Samuel to drive the Farmel in front of the funeral procession. The old engine echoed gently through the streets of Hayes. People removed their hats as it passed. No parade, no speeches, just the quiet sound of machines saying goodbye to the man who had kept it alive for decades. Years continued slipping by. Richard retired from banking in 2003. Instead of moving away, he began volunteering with young agricultural students at the local community college. Whenever someone asked about risk, he always shared one story. Not about money, about listening. He never hid the fact that he had laughed. "I thought I understood farming," he would tell them. "Then a 19-year-old taught me that confidence without curiosity is just another form of ignorance." Samuel eventually married. His wife, Emily, loved the farm as deeply as he did. Together they raised 2 children who learned to drive the Farmel long before they were trusted with newer equipment. The notebook became several notebooks, each one filled with observations collected across decades. When drought returned to western Kansas during the early 2010s, neighboring farmers often stopped by for advice. Samuel never claimed to have all the answers. He simply shared what the land had taught him. Have you ever discovered that the greatest treasure in your life wasn't something you found? It was something you finally learned to understand. Sometimes the answer isn't hidden because it's impossible to see. Sometimes it's hidden because everyone stopped looking too soon. In the autumn of 2021, at the age of 57, Samuel stood beside the same well drilled nearly 4 decades earlier. The pump still ran. The water remained clear. Nearby, the Farmel idled softly after another day of mowing field edges. His son shut off the engine. The familiar silence settled across the farm. Samuel rested one weathered hand against the tractor's hood exactly as he had on the first day he owned it. The cast iron felt warm beneath his fingers. For a long moment, nobody spoke. There was nothing left to prove, only something worth protecting. When Samuel passed away peacefully several years later, the farm stayed exactly where he had always hoped it would, in the Carter family. His children refused offers from developers. They continued farming the same 120 acres. The old notebook remained on a shelf inside the farmhouse. The farmers still started every season. The wells still supplied clean water. Visitors occasionally asked why they never replaced the old tractor. Samuel's son always gave the same answer: because it still keeps its promises. Some things are never truly worthless. They simply wait for someone patient enough to understand what everyone else was too certain to see. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly believed in something when nobody else did, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a farmer, a parent, a grandparent, or a neighbor who saw value where everyone else saw failure. I read those stories because they're part of the same tradition these fields remember. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who rescued a forgotten steam engine from a flooded riverbank and uncovered a family secret buried for half a century, that story is waiting, and I hope you'll be here when we tell it.